For 20 years, the sea tried to kill him. The gods tried to erase him. Monsters failed to stop him. And the world believed he was dead. But he returned. Not as a king. As a beggar. A stranger in his own home, hiding even his own name. And that night, a bow was drawn, the truth was revealed, and justice spoke without mercy. This is the return of Odysseus. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we loosen the ropes and let the shore fall away behind us. We are setting sail across wine-dark waters, into a world shaped by storms, songs, and gods who listen more closely than men believe. This is the Odyssey in its entirety, a story of distance and devotion, of cleverness sharpened by suffering, of curses earned and kindness remembered, and of one man whose greatest wish was not glory, but home. As always, I would love to know where you are listening from, and what hour has found you. Whether the moon is drifting past your window, or the night is wrapped close around you with a warm drink in hand, this time is yours. Settle in. Let the noise of the day fade. These words come from a story older than empires, carried once by firelight and memory beneath open skies. Tonight, they belong to you. The city burned for days. Smoke climbed into the morning air in heavy, blackened pillars, twisting upward like prayers that no god intended to answer. The smell of ash and melted stone lingered far beyond the walls, carried on the wind across fields that had once known peace. Even leagues away, the air tasted of ruin. This had been Ilium, Troy, proud and unyielding, a city of high towers and broad gates, its walls laid by divine hands and thought unbreakable by mortal force. For 10 bitter years it had resisted the combined might of Greece. 10 years of bloodshed beneath an unforgiving sun. 10 years of sons buried far from home. Yet stone does not last forever. And walls, no matter how high, cannot defend against deceit when it arrives wearing the shape of a gift. The horse stood silent in the heart of the city, vast and hollow, its wooden flanks smooth beneath torchlight. It had been pulled through the gates with laughter and relief, welcomed as a trophy and an ending. No one heard the breath held within its ribs. No one listened closely enough to the silence. Inside waited death. Warriors chosen for patience rather than rage lay folded within the timber shell, weapons pressed close, eyes open in the dark. They waited while night fell and wine flowed. They waited while the city slept, its guards dulled by celebration, its people dreaming of peace. When they emerged, there was no battle, only slaughter. Fire followed steel. Streets ran red. Doors were broken down. By dawn, the sun rose not over Troy, but over what remained of it, shattered walls, fallen temples, and silence thick enough to choke on. Among the wreckage walked Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Lethes. He was known across the isles not for the weight of his spear, but for the sharpness of his mind. The horse had been his idea. The victory, in many ways, bore his signature. And yet he did not cheer as the gates fell. He did not lift his voice in triumph as palaces collapsed and marble columns groaned like trees torn from the earth. He walked barefoot through the ruins, his sandals crunching over stone and bone alike, moving like a man already burdened by ghosts. He saw bodies half buried in rubble, armor blackened by fire, women sprawled with eyes still open to a sky that had offered no mercy. Children lay curled where even gods might hesitate to look. This was victory. And it was empty. War does not end all at once. It does not close like a door or settle like dust. It drains away slowly, leaving behind a strange quiet, the kind that makes men uneasy. The cries fade. The rage cools. And what remains is the realization of what has been lost, and what cannot be undone. Odysseus had gone to war with dark hair unmarked by time, with a young son clinging to his wife's side and promises spoken lightly, as men do when they believe the gods are watching closely. Now he was leaner, harder, shaped by years of hunger and command. He had learned what glory costs. Other kings spoke of home with excitement, of feasts and songs and honor. Odysseus thought only of Ithaca, of rocky hills and olive groves, of the smell of salt and thyme carried on the wind. He thought of Penelope, steady and patient, weaving beneath lamplight. He thought of Telemachus, the child he had left behind, who might now stand at the edge of manhood, uncertain whether his father lived or died. Centuries later, scholars would dig into the soil of northwestern Anatolia and uncover Troy's bones. They would name its layers, measure its ashes, and argue whether Homer's song held truth. They would find scorched stone, shattered gates, arrowheads buried where doors once stood. They would say the war was real. But here, in this moment, there were no historians. Only the dead, the victors, and a weary king whose eyes had already turned toward the sea. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke away from the shore. It was time. Odysseus gathered his men, those who remained. Their ships waited in the shallows, dark-hulled and scarred, timbers creaking like animals too long worked without rest. No songs rose as they boarded. No cheers marked their departure. Only the dull rhythm of oars entering water and the soft groan of wood under strain. Behind them, Troy smoldered. Ahead lay the open sea. No one aboard truly understood what waited beyond the horizon. Least of all Odysseus. And far above, on the heights of Olympus, the gods began to watch more closely. The sea was calm when they left, a smooth expanse of silver and shadow, reflecting both sky and smoke. The ships moved slowly at first, as if reluctant to disturb the stillness. The oars dipped with measured care. Even the water seemed subdued, as though aware of what had passed. There was no laughter on deck. Triumph had turned to ash in the mouth. 10 years of war had taken more than youth and comrades. It had taken certainty. What lay ahead was not peace, but distance. Odysseus stood at the prow, cloak gathered around him, one hand resting against the rail. His gaze fixed on the horizon where sky and water merged into nothing at all. In his mind, Ithaca took shape, its harsh beauty, its narrow shores, the palace where a single lamp might still burn at night. Would Penelope still wait? Would Telemachus know him? Or had time erased him, as waves erase markings in sand? Around him, the men rowed in silence. Some stared into the water as though answers might rise from its depths. Others touched small charms hidden beneath tunics, tokens given by wives, mothers, children. Each carried home in his thoughts, though none could see the path. The Aegean was never gentle for long, nor were the gods. While the ships slipped across calm waters, rivalries began to stir among Olympus. Old alliances frayed. Pride demanded payment. And though Odysseus did not yet know it, the gaze of Poseidon had settled upon him. The sea god remembered the fall of Troy. He remembered cleverness used as a weapon. For a time, he allowed the ship safe passage. But the ocean never forgets. Stars rose each night, familiar yet subtly altered, as if even the heavens had shifted during the years of slaughter. The winds remained warm, but beneath them lurked the promise of something harsher. Odysseus spoke little. His commands were precise, his silence deliberate. He understood better than most that their journey home would not be straight. Too many gods had watched Troy burn. Too many debts had been incurred. The road ahead would be carved not only by sail and oar, but by fate, endurance, and loss. And so they sailed on, past the last familiar capes of Anatolia, into deeper waters where the currents no longer answered to memory, and where the true story had only just begun. Each dawn arrived with a different sky, and with it, a different danger. There were no charts to guide them now, no neat lines scratched into parchment that promised safe passage. What lay ahead existed only in fragments of old stories, half-remembered warnings whispered by sailors long dead. Tales of islands that drifted like thoughts, of winds that shattered ships as easily as bone, of voices that sang men into the sea and left nothing behind but silence. Once, the men had laughed at such stories around campfires. They did not laugh anymore. Night after night, Odysseus stood alone beneath the stars, listening not for thunder or surf, but for change. The war was finished, yet his bones told him the truth: this was only the beginning. The sea did not grant peace simply because swords had been laid down. In the days after Troy, the waters grew unsettled, not with rage, but with uncertainty. Winds arrived without pattern. Currents tugged at the hulls as though the sea itself could not decide where to send them. One morning the sails swelled full, the next they hung limp and lifeless. The men spoke less. Hunger crept in quietly. Fatigue followed close behind. When land appeared again, it was the coast of Thrace. There, nestled between rolling green hills and the dark wine-colored sea, stood the city of Ismarus. It looked gentle from afar. Fertile slopes, calm water, a place that seemed untouched by the long cruelty of war. But the men who gazed upon it no longer knew how to see peace. For 10 years, they had taken what they needed with fire and iron. Habit had hardened into instinct. Odysseus did not order them ashore, but neither did he forbid it. At dawn, they landed. Mist still clung to the streets when the Greeks descended. Guards were caught half awake. Doors splintered. Cries rose and fell too quickly to echo. Men were cut down. Storehouses broken open. Temples stripped bare. Wine flowed freely, stolen and thick with sweetness. Fires were lit, and laughter returned, sharp and careless. Odysseus urged restraint. "Take what you must," he warned. "Then leave." He had seen what delay could cost. He had watched pride hollow a city until nothing remained but ash. But his men, drunk on victory and memory, refused to listen. They wanted one more night. One more celebration. One more moment to pretend the war still justified their cruelty. At first light, the reckoning came. The Cicones returned, not scattered, but united. Warriors poured down from the hills in disciplined ranks, bronze catching the sun like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Arrows fell like rain. Spears cut through surf and flesh alike. The Greeks, heavy with wine and sleep, scrambled to form lines in the sand. Men who had survived a decade beneath Trojan walls fell here, unnamed and unremembered, struck down by farmers defending their homes. Odysseus fought with desperate precision. He shouted orders until his voice broke. He dragged wounded men toward the ships. Shields rose. Oars plunged. Blood darkened the water as they fled. 6 men from each ship were lost. No songs would be written for them. No stones carved with their names. Their graves were the shallows, their memorial the silence that followed. As Ismarus burned behind them, old fires mingling with new, Odysseus did not look away in anger or shame. Only understanding remained. This was not punishment. It was reminder. The gods had not turned their eyes elsewhere simply because Troy had fallen. The sea grew stranger still. Days passed without markers. Winds carried them south along paths no one could name. Stars shifted subtly, as if the heavens themselves had changed while men were busy destroying one another. No birds followed the ships. No dolphins broke the surface. The sun burned pale and distant, offering light without warmth. time began to loosen. When land appeared again, it arrived without announcement, a low, quiet shore, pale and still. Trees clustered near the water, their branches heavy with unfamiliar fruit. There were no walls, no smoke, no sound. It felt like a place that dreamed. Odysseus anchored in the shallows and sent scouts inland, giving careful instructions. He watched them disappear into the trees and waited. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. The sun barely moved. When the scouts did not return, unease settled over him like frost. He armed himself and followed, tracing broken grass and bent stems deeper into the grove. The forest was silent, but not hostile. Birds watched without fear. The air carried a scent of sweetness, thick, heavy, almost soothing. He found the men reclining beside a pool of still water. They looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Their eyes were half-lidded. Their limbs slack. Smiles rested on their faces like sleep. One of them lifted his hand and offered Odysseus a piece of golden fruit. His voice moved slowly, each word unhurried, warm, distant. He spoke of the lotus eaters, of welcome, of kindness, of forgetting. One taste, he said, and sorrow faded. One taste, and war vanished. One taste, and Ithaca no longer mattered. Odysseus saw the truth at once. This was no poison of the body, but of the will. It did not kill. It erased. And what it erased could never be reclaimed. Without hesitation, he seized the man and dragged him to his feet. The others protested weakly, their voices soft with longing. Odysseus shouted them into obedience, his command sharp enough to cut through the haze. They bound the men and carried them back to the ships as the dreamers wept and begged to remain, whispering the fruit's name like a lullaby. When the sails were raised, the wind returned, as though the sea itself had been waiting for a choice to be made. As the island faded into mist, Odysseus stood at the stern in silence. The bound men cried for what they believed they had lost, not understanding that what they mourned had never truly belonged to them. The lotus eaters were not cruel. They offered peace. But it was a peace without roots, without memory, without return. And Odysseus knew then what the journey demanded. To go home, one must remember why home matters. The Cyclops and the cost of pride. That night, as the sea rolled gently beneath the hull and the stars blinked overhead like the patient eyes of forgotten gods, Odysseus kept his vigil. He did not sleep. Sleep felt dangerous now, like surrender. The deck was cool beneath his feet, the air heavy with salt and thought. He thought of Penelope, of her steady hands, her quiet strength, the way she used to watch the horizon even when no ships were due. He thought of the child he had left behind, no longer a child at all. 20 years was a long time for love to wait, and longer still for memory to remain sharp. He thought of the men buried in foreign sounds, of ships yet to be broken, of storms still coiled in the future. And he thought of the fruit. How easy it would have been. One bite, and the noise would fade. The sea would soften. The gods would fall silent. The ache in his chest would loosen its grip. Forgetting was not violent. It did not demand blood. It only asked for permission. Odysseus clenched his fists until his nails cut into his palms. He whispered the name of Ithaca again and again, not as a prayer, but as a weapon. By the time the sun rose, the name felt sharp in his mouth. They sailed west after leaving the Lotus Island, the wind thick and uncooperative, as though the sea itself resented their refusal to forget. The men were quiet now. No one spoke of the golden fruit or the gentle dreams it promised. They sat at the oars, shoulders hunched, eyes dulled, rowing as if each stroke carried them farther from something they could almost remember, but no longer name. Odysseus watched them closely. He felt a new danger settling over the journey. Not the sudden violence of storms or blades, but something slower. Erosion. Each trial took something invisible. Each shore offered a different kind of death. When land appeared again, it rose harshly from the sea, a jagged coastline like broken teeth biting into the surf. Sheer cliffs plunged straight into the water. There were no harbors, no signs of welcome. Just stone, scrub, and silence. They followed the coast until they found a narrow inlet, a crescent of calm water guarded by rock and reef. Fresh water spilled from a spring. A meadow stretched inland, thick with grass and dotted with wild goats. It was a place made for rest. Odysseus ordered the ship hauled ashore. The men ate well that night, hunting easily among the hills, roasting meat over open fires. Laughter returned, cautious but real. Yet Odysseus's gaze kept drifting inland. From the ridge above the cove, he had seen something unsettling. A cave. It yawned from the cliff face like the mouth of a sleeping creature. Nearby stood pens of stacked stone and timber. Sheep grazed freely, unguarded, unafraid. There were signs of life, but no roads. No fields. No ships. This place did not belong to men. At dawn, Odysseus chose 12 companions and set out toward the cave, leaving the others to guard the ship. He carried with him a skin of wine, dark, potent, dangerous. A gift once given by a priest of Apollo, strong enough to fell a man even when diluted. Odysseus had kept it hidden through war and wandering, saving it for a moment when strength alone would not suffice. As they climbed, the land grew stranger. No plow mark scarred the earth. The air smelled of animals and damp stone. The cave loomed larger with every step, its entrance blackened with the soot of old fires. Inside, they found abundance and scale. Great jars of milk and cheese. Racks of drying meat. Tools far too large for human hands. The sheep themselves were immense, heavy with wool, placid and silent. Everything spoke of a being shaped by a different order of the world. Hunger overcame fear. The men lit a fire. They ate. They waited. The owner returned at dusk. They heard him before they saw him, stones shifting beneath his weight, the earth responding to his presence. The sheep entered first, obedient and calm. Then the giant filled the cave mouth. He was enormous, his shoulders brushing stone. His face was crude and uneven, but it was the single eye in the center of his brow that froze them where they stood, dark, wide, unblinking. He sealed the cave with a slab of rock so massive no group of men could have moved it. Then he saw them. There was no greeting. No question. He seized 2 men and smashed them against the stone, devouring them as one might eat fruit, blood running down his beard like spilled wine. The others scattered into shadow, screaming, but there was nowhere to flee. Odysseus said nothing. He watched. He waited. That night, as the Cyclops slept, bloated, drunken, snoring like a mountain breaking, Odysseus shaped his plan. There would be no blade strong enough. No force sufficient. Only cunning remained. At dawn, when the giant stirred and took another man for his meal, Odysseus stepped forward with the wine. He bowed low. He spoke softly. The Cyclops drank, and drank again and again. His words slurred. His great body sagged. When the monster asked his name, Odysseus smiled. Nobody. Later, as the Cyclops collapsed into wine-heavy sleep, Odysseus revealed the sharpened stake of olive wood. Heated red-hot in the fire, it was driven into the single eye with a sound like splitting timber. The cave shook with the creature's screams. Blinded, raging, the Cyclops called for help. When the others asked who had harmed him, he cried out, "Nobody." And so they left him. At dawn, the Greeks escaped beneath the bellies of sheep, clinging to wool as life itself passed inches from death. The Cyclops felt only backs and hides. No men. They ran for the ship. As they pulled away, Odysseus could not restrain himself. Pride rose like a tide. He shouted his true name into the cliffs, claiming his victory. The Cyclops answered with a prayer. And far below the waves, the sea god listened. The ship fled the shore, Oz biting water with desperate rhythm. The men were bruised, bleeding, exhausted, but alive. Smoke still curled from the cave behind them. The howls of the blinded giant echoed faintly across the sea. Silence fell. Then Odysseus stood at the stern, the wind filling the sails at last. And with that single cry of pride, the long anger of the sea was awakened. The name that woke the sea. The ship had begun to settle into an easier rhythm. The oars dipped and rose in time. The water no longer fought them. For the first time since the cave, the danger felt as though it were receding, slipping back into shadow. Odysseus stood at the stern and looked once more toward the island. The black mouth of the cave still gaped in the cliff face, silent now, emptied of its terror. Smoke drifted faintly from within, dissolving into the morning air. And something in him stirred. It was not caution. It was not wisdom. It was the old fire that had carried him through councils of kings and battlefields slick with blood. The need to be known. To leave a mark. He raised his voice. Not a farewell, but a name. "I am Odysseus," he shouted, his words cutting across the water. "Son of Lates. King of Ithaca. Tell your father who blinded you. Tell him who outwitted you. Tell him who made you howl." The men froze. Oars slipped from hands. The rhythm broke. Faces turned toward their captain in disbelief, as though he had hurled a stone into still water, and they were all watching the ripples spread, slow and widening. For a breath, the world held itself still. The cliffs stood unmoving. The sea lapped softly against the hull. Somewhere in the hills, sheep bleated, unaware of what had just been set in motion. Then the roar came. It rose from the island like the breaking of mountains. A voice thick with agony and rage, striking the air and water alike. The Cyclops had heard. And with his shattered eye and bleeding mouth, he called upon his father. Poseidon, Earthshaker, Lord of the Sea, brother of Zeus and Hades, god of salt, storm, and vengeance older than ships or shores. The water beneath the hull shivered. The wind twisted as though seized by unseen hands. Clouds gathered where moments before the sky had been clear. The sea seemed to inhale, drawing breath deep beneath the keel. The sky darkened to the color of iron. Every man aboard knew with the cold certainty that settles in the belly like stone, that the sea would never again be safe. Poseidon did not answer with words. He did not need to. His reply came in the turning of tides, in the sudden pitch of the ship, in the way the horizon itself seemed to lean away from them. It came in the tightening of Odysseus's jaw. He felt it at once. The truth of what he had done. His pride had struck deeper than the stake driven into the Cyclops' eye. He had named himself before the gods. And gods do not forget. That night, they found no harbor. The winds drove them south, then east, then back west again, as if the sea itself could not decide where to cast them. Stars vanished behind veils of cloud. The moon showed itself only as a thin blade before disappearing entirely. Men clung to the rails and whispered prayers that went unanswered. Some wept. Some cursed. All of them looked, again and again, toward Odysseus. He had led them to Troy. He had led them out of the cave. And now he had drawn the wrath of a god who ruled the waters beneath their feet. Odysseus did not sleep. He stood at the stern, one hand gripping the tiller, the other wrapped in his cloak against the cold. His face was unreadable, carved into stillness like stone. Inside him, shame burned hotter than the pride that had sparked it. He had outwitted a monster. But he had forgotten that monsters have fathers. And divine fathers have long memories and endless reach. When morning came, the sea lay calm once more. But it was not peace. It was the silence before a storm. Odysseus felt it in his bones. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The sea would rise against him again and again, not because he had erred in ignorance, but because he had spoken his name in triumph. The gods, above all else, do not suffer mortals who forget their place. The days that followed were restless and grim. The men grew hollow-eyed, their shoulders bowed beneath sleepless nights. Each dawn brought uncertainty. Each dusk carried the scent of dread. The wind did not howl. It whispered. It shifted direction without warning, cunning and malicious, refusing to be charted. The stars no longer felt reliable. Constellations twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The moon hid more often than it shone. Odysseus stood at the helm through much of it, hands blistered by rope and salt. He was no longer merely navigating waves. He was navigating the will of gods. And that was a crueler current. On the 12th day after fleeing the Cyclopes island, land appeared once more. This island was unlike any they had seen. It rose from the sea in smooth green swells. Its cliffs were crowned with towers that gleamed, not with marble, but with polished bronze, glowing like fire beneath the sun. The harbor was gentle. The air smelled not of brine and decay, but of cedar and spice. The men exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for days. Even the sea seemed to bow as they approached. This was Aeolia, the floating island of the winds. Its halls were carved into living rock and polished until the stone shone like pearl. The air within was alive, stirring without source. Voices echoed softly, like birds calling across unseen skies. Airless, keeper of the winds, received Odysseus with measured courtesy. He was no warrior, no priest, but a warden appointed by Zeus himself, entrusted with the breath of the world. They feasted for a full month. Odysseus told his tale: the fall of Troy, the raid on the Cicones, the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops. Aeolus listened in silence, his expression darkening as the thread of divine anger wove itself through the story. When Odysseus finished, Aeolus made his gift. Not gold. Not weapons. A bag. Into it, he sealed every wind that might oppose them, binding it with silver cord. Only the gentle west wind was left free, to carry them home. Ithaca lies close now, Aeolus said. 10 days, if the bag remains closed. Odysseus bowed, gratitude heavy in his chest. They sailed at dawn. The west wind filled the sails. The ship flew. The men sang again. Laughter returned, fragile but real. And on the horizon, Ithaca appeared, pale cliffs rising through the morning haze like a memory made solid. For the first time, Odysseus slept. And while he dreamed of Penelope's arms and his son's voice, curiosity turned to suspicion among the crew. The bag was guarded like treasure. Whispers grew sharp. When the cords were cut, the wind screamed free. The sky broke. The sea rose. And home vanished once more. The journey was not finished. It had only just learned how to punish pride. Of closed gates, open jaws, and a quiet green shore. When they reached the island of Aeolia again, there was no celebration. The ships arrived battered, their sails torn thin by winds that had no patience left for mercy. The men were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their hands trembling as they hauled ropes that once felt familiar. Hunger clung to them like a second skin. Hope no longer walked openly among them. It kept its distance. Odysseus climbed the hill alone. He carried the windbag in his arms, now empty and slack, folded upon itself like a thing that had lost its purpose. He held it close to his chest, not as a gift, but as one might hold a child who will not wake. Airless met him at the gate. He needed no explanation. One look at Odysseus's face, at the useless bag, at the way the wind stirred restlessly behind him, told the whole story. Airless's shoulders sank. He did not rage. He did not accuse. He simply shook his head. "The gods have turned against you," he said quietly. "I cannot shelter a man marked by heaven's anger. Leave this place. Do not return." The gate closed. No curses followed them back to the shore. No storms rose in protest. Only silence. And that silence was heavier than any wind. They sailed again into open water with nothing bound and nothing promised. The gods did not speak. Ithaca lived only as a thin flame in memory, flickering just beyond reach. Odysseus stood at the bow, his hands empty now. No gifts remained. Only trials. The sea, restless in its patience, carried them onward. It does not need to roar to destroy you, the sea. It can lull. It can promise. It can kill you between breaths. After Aeolia, they drifted, not in storm, but in stillness. The sky lay low and grey, like a lid pressed down upon the world. The waves moved without urgency, without kindness. This was not peace. It was absence. Days passed. The water grew stale. The food dwindled. The men stopped asking questions. Their prayers shrank into private murmurs, spoken to the deck beneath their feet or the empty air above them, words not meant to be answered. Then land appeared. A coastline curled into the sea like a hooked claw. Steep cliffs rose sharply, scraping the bellies of clouds. The harbor was narrow and deep, its waters dark and unmoving, as though the sea itself had paused its breath. No fishing boats. No smoke. No roads. Only a smell, faint, wrong, like meat left too long beneath the sun. The men were exhausted. Even danger can look like refuge when weariness has worn the edge from fear. Odysseus ordered the sails lowered. The ships entered the harbor one by one. All but his. Odysseus held back. He had learned the cost of still water and high cliffs. He sent scouts instead, a small group, weary and tired, climbing the narrow path that twisted upward along the rock face. At the summit, they found a settlement, but not a city as men understand cities. The houses were crude, carved into stone or piled from boulders. Smoke clung thickly to the air. Blood darkened the ground. And then they saw her. A girl stood at a well, pale and tall, holding a pitcher in her hands. Her gaze slid over them without recognition, until it didn't. She turned and ran, vanishing between the stone dwellings. The men followed. They should not have. She did not return with the father. She returned with her king. He was not a man, but a giant, broad as a warhorse, twice the height of any sailor. His skin was the color of weathered granite. His eyes burned with a hunger that knew no question and no restraint. He seized one of the scouts before a cry could fully form. The man's spine broke across the giant's knee like dry wood. His body struck the stone wall and fell without sound. The others ran. Too late. These were the Laestrygonians, an ancient people, older than cities, older perhaps than mercy. Their hunger was not for land or gold, but for flesh. Below, the harbor had become a trap. Giants poured down from the heights, hurling stones the size of oxen. Ships shattered against the harbor walls. Sailors leapt into the sea only to be speared from shore or dragged screaming from the water. The sea turned red. The screams rose and fell like the howling of animals in a storm. Only one ship escaped. Odysseus had seen the first stone fall. He did not wait for the second. He gave the order, and his oarsmen pulled as though death itself sat at their heels. They fled. Behind them, the harbor burned. The giants roared in triumph, their mouths wet with what remained of men who had survived 10 years of war, only to be devoured in a single morning. When the cursed shore vanished from sight, Odysseus looked upon what remained. One ship, one crew, 11 ships lost, hundreds dead. The deck was silent save for the quiet weeping of those too empty to scream. No one spoke of vengeance. No one asked why. This was not punishment. This was hunger. That night, Odysseus stood alone at the prow. He did not speak. He did not cry. He counted the dead by the weight in his chest. When dawn came, he turned his face away from it. The gods had taken much. They had left him only the road. And he would walk it. Days later, land rose again from the mist, soft, green, almost gentle. The island of Ithaca lay before them, ringed with forests and crowned with low hills that breathed smoke into the sky. It looked harmless. After Laestrygonia, they trusted nothing. They beached the ship and stepped ashore with care. Fires were lit. Game was plentiful. Meat roasted. For the first time in many days, laughter returned, hesitant, fragile. Odysseus did not join it. Ease, he had learned, was often the mask danger wore best. On the third day, he sent scouts inland. 20 men. A careful leader. They followed a winding path through trees that did not fear them, past streams that whispered like secrets. At the hill's crest stood a house of polished stone, roofed in copper, gleaming in the sun like something meant to be admired. And there, unseen, another trial waited. Of song, forgetting, and the road that turns toward the dead. From within the house came singing. It was a woman's voice, low and steady, neither loud nor hurried, drifting through the air like smoke that knows exactly where to settle. The words were unfamiliar, shaped in a tongue that did not belong to any shore the men had known. Yet the melody itself felt intimate, as if it had been waiting for them long before they ever set foot upon the island. The men slowed. Eurylochus felt the warning before he found the words. He urged caution, spoke of ambush and unseen danger, but hunger is louder than wisdom, and weariness dulls even the sharpest fear. One by one, the others stepped forward. They knocked. The door opened. Circe stood before them. Later, stories would speak of her beauty, and they would not be wrong. But beauty alone does not still the feet or quiet the mind. What held them was something colder and deeper, the calm in her eyes, the untroubled stillness of her face, the way she regarded them as though she had already read the whole of their lives and found nothing surprising there. She smiled. She beckoned. They entered. Her hall was warm, filled with amber light that softened every edge. Food covered the tables in careful abundance. Wine glowed red as garnet in cups of beaten gold. Laughter rose easily, as if it had been waiting just beyond the door. Only Eurylochus stayed outside. He watched the door close. He listened to the laughter swell and echo within. He waited. They did not return. When fear finally overcame hope, Eurylochus ran. He fled down the hill and back to the shore, pale and shaking, his words tumbling over one another like loose stones. But the truth beneath them was clear enough. The men were gone. The woman was no woman alone. Odysseus did not hesitate. He girded his sword, slung his shield across his back, and began the climb himself. He walked alone. The wind lifted his cloak behind him, and the earth seemed to watch his passage, silent and attentive. On the path, a stranger appeared. Young, bright-eyed, cloaked in the likeness of a mortal man. But Odysseus had walked too long among gods and ghosts to be deceived. Hermes stood before him, messenger of Olympus, quick with warning and quicker still with gifts. The woman was Circe, daughter of Helios, born of fire and ancient blood. A sorceress whose spells bent flesh as easily as thought. Odysseus's men, Hermes said, now wandered her pens as beasts, pigs, fattened and docile, fed from her hand. But there was hope. From his robe, Hermes drew a single flower, a black stem, pale petals white as new snow. Moly, he named it, a guard against enchantment. Take it, he said, and her magic will not hold. Odysseus thanked him and continued on. He knocked once and entered. The hall was just as Eurylochus had described. Warm, bright, heavy with perfume and the scent of roasted meat. Circe sat at the table's head, her gaze curious, her smile unreadable. She offered him wine. He took it. She stirred the cup with a silver wand, whispering words no man was meant to hear. She placed the drink into his hands. Odysseus drank. Nothing happened. Her eyes narrowed. She stepped forward and raised her wand, but Odysseus was faster. His sword flashed free and stopped at her throat, its edge singing softly in the air. For a breathless moment, all time stood still. Then Circe laughed. Not in mockery, not in anger, but in something close to relief. You are not like the others, she said. Odysseus lowered his blade. She swore him no harm. She kissed his hand. She offered peace. The spell was broken. The men returned slowly to themselves. They stumbled from her pens, blinking, dazed, their minds rising as if from deep water. They had not known they were beasts. Their thoughts had been fog and instinct alone. Now memory returned, and with it, shame. They remembered the warmth of the hall, the sweetness of the wine, the comfort of her gaze. They remembered trust. That was the cruelest wound. Circe asked forgiveness. Her voice was soft. Her eyes were clear. Whether the sorrow was true or merely well practiced, no man could say. Still, Odysseus did not strike her. He sheathed his sword and accepted her welcome. Perhaps he had seen too much cruelty to recognize it when it wore kindness. Or perhaps he knew that even monsters can grow weary of their own hunger. They stayed. Circe gave them food and beds and songs in the long evenings. The house breathed around them. Tapestries lined the walls. Stone floors gleamed with color. Strange herbs perfumed the air, flowers that bloomed nowhere else. The nights were warm. The men laughed again, without bitterness. They laid down their weapons. They washed the blood from their skin and allowed their wounds to close. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The ship lay forgotten on the beach. Moss crept along its hull. The oars were stacked like unused tools. The sails slept, folded and dry. Circe was more than a sorceress. She was something older than Olympus, touched by fire, star, and sea. Her voice could calm a man's heart, or unmake it. And yet, she was lonely. In Odysseus, she found not only a warrior, but a mind sharp enough to meet her own. They spoke long into the night of gods and silence, of stars and the dead. He spoke of Ithaca sometimes, but less with each passing moon. He stayed. But the gods do not forget. One evening, as the sun bled into the sea and the hills turned bronze, Odysseus stood alone on a cliff and looked westward. Ithaca lived there only as memory now, thinner than before. Penelope's face flickered like a fading flame. Telemachus's voice had grown faint as wind across stone. He had lingered too long. That night, Circe said nothing. She watched him pace the halls. And in the morning, she met him with a solemn face and spoke of the road ahead. It led not across any sea he had known, but downward. He must go to the land of the dead. To the edge of the world where ocean encircles all things and the shadows of men wander forever. There he must seek Tiresias, the blind prophet whose soul still remembered what the living had forgotten. Only the dead could show him the way home. Odysseus did not argue. She gave him the rites, the words, the black ram, the sacred blood. Her voice did not tremble. But when he turned to leave, her hand lingered on his arm just a moment too long. At dawn, they sailed. Circe stood on the shore and watched them go, silent. As the ship slipped into the darkening sea, her figure grew smaller, until even a goddess looked like just another woman left behind by war. The water turned colder. The sky grew heavy. The wind carried the scent of ash and forgotten things. They sailed toward the edge of death. Odysseus stood alone at the prow, Circe's cloak tight around his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. He did not look back. Of the dead who remember, and the songs that unmake the will. There was no courage in him as the ship moved forward into the farthest reaches of the world. Only duty remained. Only the long, grinding persistence of a man who had survived too much to believe in endings, and yet could not stop walking toward one. He did not sail with hope. He sailed because the road had not yet released him. At last, they reached the place spoken of in whispers. The river ocean. Black and endless, it curled around the rim of the world like a great serpent at rest, its coils ancient, its patience absolute. The water did not ripple. It did not shimmer or sing. It moved with the slow, inward motion of thought itself, as if the world were remembering something it had tried very hard to forget. The trees along its banks were gray and leafless, stripped not by season but by time. No birds nested there. No insect stirred. Even the wind moved reluctantly, sighing through hollow branches as though the air itself were weary. Odysseus gave the command to stop. They beached the ship upon the shore of what could not truly be called land. And Odysseus stepped down from the hull with the reverence of a man entering a tomb that had waited centuries for his name. He drew his sword. The rites began. The pit was cut into the earth in silence, a square wound opened in the skin of the world. Around it, he poured the libations, honey and wine, water and sacred barley. Then came the black ram. Its throat was cut clean. Its life spilled into the ground with a hiss that sounded far too loud in that absolute stillness. The men stood behind him, cloaks drawn tight, mouths dry. They did not speak. They did not look away. Already the air was changing. Already, the darkness was moving. They came without sound. The dead. Pale shapes drifted from the edges of sight, gathering like smoke given shape, drawn by the scent of blood and the memory of breath. Their eyes were hollow. Their mouths opened as if to speak, but no words came. They pressed inward, crowding the pit with the hunger of centuries. Odysseus stood over the offering, sword raised, guarding the blood. His voice carried into the gloom as he called for Tiresias, the blind prophet, the one who knew the roads even the gods refused to walk. But Tiresias did not come first. Instead, the past rose. A young shade stepped forward, uncertain and trembling. Elpina, the youngest of the crew. The boy who had drunk too deeply in Circe's hall and fallen from the roof in careless sleep. His neck had snapped like greenwood. He did not ask for justice. He did not ask for vengeance. Only burial. "Do not leave me unburned," he pleaded. "Do not let me wander without peace." Odysseus promised. He took the boy's name into his heart and sent him back into the dark with that single mercy. Then another shape emerged. A woman, tall and quiet. His mother. Dead before his return. Dead without knowing whether he still lived. Her eyes held no anger, no reproach, only the deep stillness of those who have waited long enough to stop expecting answers. She spoke of Ithaca. Of Penelope, still weaving and unweaving her grief. Of Telemachus, grown without a father's voice to shape him. Of strangers feasting in his halls, fattening themselves on absence. And Odysseus wept. Not as a king. Not as a warrior. But as a man who had walked forward so long he had forgotten how much of himself had been left behind. He reached for her. She slipped through his arms like mist through reeds. The dead do not embrace. They remember. Then at last, Tiresias came. Tall and spare, blind even in death, yet his face held a vision sharper than any living eye. He drank from the blood, and ancient knowledge stirred within him. The way home, he said, would not shorten. Poseidon's wrath was not spent. The sea would not forgive. He spoke of trials yet to come. Of sacred cattle that must not be touched. Of narrow straits and devouring mouths. Of voices that would promise wisdom and offer ruin. And at the end, he spoke of death. Not a violent end. Not a glorious one. A quiet death, far from the sea, after peace had been earned and the world had learned to forget his name. That would be his rest. The wind rose. The river groaned. The dead pressed closer, drawn by warmth and breath. Odysseus stepped back, sword raised, and ordered retreat. They fled the pit, leaving blood to sink into the waiting soil, and cast off into the cold familiarity of the living sea. Odysseus did not speak. He sat at the stern as the shore of shadows vanished behind them, the prophet's voice echoing like dust in a sealed chamber. Something within him had shifted. He had walked among the dead and felt the full weight of time. Though the ship moved forward, part of him had begun to turn back. They returned briefly to Circe's island to bury Elpina as promised. Stones were piled. The oar was set upright. The boy's name was spoken once more, and then released. Circe met them in silence. She spoke not of the dead, but of what waited ahead. Of sirens. Voices sharper than bone and sweeter than honey. Songs that did not lure the body, but the soul's hunger for forgotten truth. No man who heard them returned. Odysseus prepared. Wax was melted and pressed into every ear. He alone remained unguarded, bound upright to the mast, ropes tightened until blood marked his skin. No matter what he said, no matter how he begged, they were not to release him. The ship glided into still water. Then the song rose. Not one voice, but all voices. Not desire, but remembrance. It spoke of home, of hands once held, of names spoken with love. Odysseus screamed. He begged. He tore at the ropes until flesh gave way. The sirens appeared at last, pale and terrible, perched among the bones of those who had believed themselves strong. They sang until the sea itself seemed to listen. And then, as suddenly as breath leaving a body, the song ceased. The ship passed on. Silence returned. And Odysseus slumped against the mast, alive, broken, and still bound to the road that would not yet let him go. Of teeth and tides, and the hunger that defies heaven. The silence fell like a bell struck beneath the sea. The song was gone. The spell had broken. Odysseus collapsed against the mast, the ropes still biting into his skin, his chest heaving as though he had been dragged back from another world. He did not speak again until the island of the Sirens dissolved into mist, their rocks swallowed by distance, their voices fading into memory like a dream that leaves only ache behind. But the sea was not finished with them. The song had been only a prelude. Circe's warning pressed against Odysseus's thoughts as the ship moved forward, of a passage straight and narrow, a wound carved into the body of the sea where no vessel passed without loss. A place where choice itself was a cruelty. On one side waited Scylla. Not a storm, not a god, but hunger given form. She clung to the cliffs like a living curse, her body hidden in stone, her 6 long necks rising and falling with patient breath. Each mouth was ringed with teeth like spears, sharp and wet and waiting. She did not rage. She did not chase. She only reached out when something came close enough to be taken. On the other side churned Charybdis, a throat in the ocean itself. 3 times a day she drank the sea whole, drawing it down into a black spiral of living hunger, and 3 times she spat it back out with a fury that could tear ships apart and grind men into foam. To be caught by her was not death, but erasure. Between them lay a channel no wider than a sling's cast. There was no clean path, only the choice of how many would die. Odysseus chose Scylla. He did not tell the men what waited ahead. Fear would not save them. It would only weaken their hands. He ordered them to row hard and steady, their strokes measured and relentless, and he took the tiller himself. The ship turned toward the cliffs. The water darkened. The air tightened. The sky seemed to narrow, pressing inward, as though the world itself were drawing breath. Then she struck. There was no roar, no warning, only motion. 6 necks lashed out of the stone like living whips. 6 mouths closed. 6 men were lifted screaming from the deck and torn upward into the mist. Their hands clawed at nothing. Their swords fell, clattering uselessly against the planks. And then they were gone. No blood. No bodies. Only absence. The rest of the crew rowed. They did not look up. They did not cry out. Their arms burned. Their hearts froze. The ship lurched forward as splinters tore from the hull, the sea roaring in every direction at once. To their left, Charybdis yawned. The ocean fell away beneath them, revealing a vast, spinning throat of black water pulling the world into itself. The current seized the ship, dragging it sideways, but at the last moment it released them. The whirlpool collapsed with a sound like the earth cracking in half. Spray drenched the deck. The men gasped like those reborn, lungs burning, eyes wide. No one cheered. No one spoke. They rowed until their muscles trembled and the cliffs fell behind them. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, it was pale and distant, as though it did not wish to look too closely at what had been taken. Odysseus counted the oars. He saw the empty benches. He remembered every name. The sea did not care. The sea never remembers. But he carried their stories like stones inside his chest, each mile heavier than the last. And still, Ithaca waited. After the strait, the world softened. The waves grew gentle, lifting and lowering the ship with a rhythm that felt almost kind. The sky cleared. The sun lingered longer in the heavens. It was not peace, not truly, but the stillness that follows a scream, the quiet after a wound has been struck and before the blood has finished spilling. The men worked in silence. They were fewer now. Each empty bench marked a life lost, a voice stilled. There was no need to speak the names. The memory of those final screams still lived in the timbers beneath their feet. Odysseus did not rest. He watched the horizon with eyes that rarely blinked, the warnings of Tiresias and Circe pressing against his mind like a hand that would not loosen its grip. They had spoken of one place above all others, an island sacred to Helios. There, beneath a sun that never truly set, grazed the cattle of heaven, golden beasts untouched by age or mortal hand. To harm them was to strike at the sky itself. No plea would be heard. No god would intervene. The punishment would be absolute. But men are fragile creatures, and hunger is more cruel than fear. As they sailed, a wind rose, harsh, steady, unyielding. No matter how tightly Odysseus gripped the rudder, the gods were steering now. The storm drove them toward the island they had been warned to avoid. They tried to pass it. Each attempt failed. The waves grew higher. The wind screamed louder. At last, with provisions low and voices rising in desperation, Odysseus relented. They anchored in a bay of unnatural calm. The land glowed beneath an unblinking sun. The cattle grazed peacefully in fields of green and gold, their hides radiant, their eyes serene. They were perfect, eternal. Odysseus gathered the crew. He told them everything. He spoke the words of Tiresias. He repeated Circe's warnings. He looked each man in the eyes and made them swear an oath, by their lives, by the lives of those already lost, that not a single beast would be harmed. For a time, they obeyed. But time itself is an enemy. Days passed. Then weeks. The storm did not lift. Food ran out. The island refused them game. The birds stayed out of reach. The fruit was bitter. The sun watched in silence. And at last, the men broke. While Odysseus wandered inland, perhaps seeking solitude, perhaps one final sign from the gods, Eurylochus stood before the others. His voice was calm, reasonable. Better to die by divine anger, he said, than to starve like animals beneath an open sky. What kind of god would deny men food while abundance stood before them? They were sacred beasts, yes, but perhaps their flesh would not rot. Perhaps this was mercy disguised as temptation. It was not defiance, he claimed. It was necessity. And so they killed. They chose the finest cattle, broad-backed and gleaming. They built a fire. They spoke prayers. They called it a ritual. But heaven was not deceived. The scent of roasting meat rose into the sky, and Helios saw. The sun god turned his gaze toward Olympus and demanded justice. If the crime went unpunished, he would drag his light into the underworld and leave the world in darkness forever. The gods listened. They agreed. Odysseus returned to laughter and full mouths and hope drunk too quickly. He knew at once what had been done. His anger was quiet. There was nothing left to say. They sailed again beneath a sky that had forgotten how to be kind. The storm vanished the moment they left the island, as if it had only waited for the crime to be complete. The sea lay calm. Too calm. The air was heavy. The sun burned without warmth. Even the gulls were gone. And in that stillness, Odysseus felt the gaze of Helios upon them. The men began to hope. They sang softly. They spoke of Ithaca. They dared to imagine the hearth, the voices waiting at the shore. Odysseus said nothing. He had learned the rhythm of the gods. Punishment does not rush. It waits. And when it came as thunder. The sky split open like a skull. Waves rose without warning, tall as mountains. The wind screamed. Lightning shattered the mast and set the sail ablaze. The sea turned violent all at once, and the ship was hurled like driftwood into the rage of heaven. And this time, there would be no escape. Of storm, drift, and the island that waits outside of time. The ship did not break all at once. It suffered. It reared and twisted like a wounded animal, its timbers shrieking under the weight of the storm. The oars snapped in their locks, flung away as if the sea itself had grown hands and chosen to tear them free. The deck split beneath the men's feet, planks lifting, collapsing, vanishing into black water. One by one, they were thrown into the waves. The sea swallowed them without ceremony. There were screams, but they did not last. There were hands reaching upward, but they found nothing to hold. No one rose again. The sea had waited a long time to reclaim them, and now it did so without haste and without mercy. Odysseus clung to a single spar. It was all that remained of the ship that had once carried hope, laughter, and oaths sworn beneath foreign stars. Now it drifted like a bone from an ancient battlefield, surrounded by wreckage and foam. All around him, the storm howled. Not like wind. Like voices. 1,000 waves crashing into one another, shrieking without tongues, speaking a language older than names. The sky answered with thunder, not sharp and sudden, but deep and endless, as though a god were breathing anger into the world. The storm did not pass quickly. It lingered. It dragged him across the surface of the sea, spinning him through darkness and foam, through hours that blurred together until time itself lost meaning. The heavens raged. The sea obeyed. There was no salvation to be found here. Only survival. And even that was cruel. At last, when the ship had been shattered so completely it could no longer be called a ship, when it had become only scattered memory and floating wood, when every man but one had vanished beneath the surface and their names were taken by the deep, the storm relented. Not gently. Simply, abruptly. The waves softened. The thunder withdrew. The sky opened, pale and distant. The sea returned to its familiar calm, as if nothing had happened at all. As if the violence had been no more than a passing mood. Only Odysseus remained. Alone. He drifted on broken timber, too stubborn to sink, carried by tides that did not know his name. Days passed. Or perhaps nights. The sun burned him without pity. Salt crusted his eyes and lips. His skin blistered and cracked. Hunger gnawed at him until it became a dull, constant ache, a companion that refused to leave. Sleep came only in fragments. In shivers. In waking dreams. He saw their faces. Eurylochus, with his sharp tongue and careful eyes. Perimedes. The boys from Ithaca who had once laughed at his stories beside the fire, still believing that war ended and men returned whole. Now they were foam. Now they were memory. He whispered their names to the sea, but the sea did not answer. It had taken what it was owed. It never explained itself. Yet the gods were not finished with him. There was still one more island. One more waiting place. One more chapter before the tale could rest. So Odysseus drifted. 9 days and 9 nights, though the number meant nothing to a man who had lost his ship, his crew, and his sense of time. The sun rose and fell, but he no longer watched it. He clung to the wreckage by instinct alone, more habit than will, half blinded by salt and burned by sky. The waves bore him as they would bear any corpse. Cradled by the deep. Rocked by winds he could no longer feel. He passed through rain and heat, silence and storm, seeing only fragments of memory between the long blinks of his dry, cracked eyes. Penelope, bent over her loom in the great hall of Ithaca, weaving and unweaving beneath torchlight. Telemachus walking the shore, calling out for a father whose name had become a question rather than a certainty. His men standing in the sun before Troy, armor bright, laughter easy, still believing in home. The images faded one by one, like breath fogging glass, until only the weight of his own breathing remained. He did not pray. He had forgotten the words. Whether it was the sea or a god that spared him, no one claimed the credit. On the 10th day, the water changed. The waves carried him gently now, as if tired of their cruelty. His broken body washed ashore upon pale sand, soft and warm, untouched by war or time. This was Ogygia, an island hidden in the folds of the world, where maps failed and memory thinned. The trees were heavy with fruit. Vines spilled down cliffs in long green ribbons. Birds sang songs no soldier had ever heard. The air smelled of flowers blooming out of season. There were no bones here. No ruins. No echoes of screams. Only the steady hum of a paradise that did not need to remember the names of men. And there, upon the shore, she found him. Calypso, daughter of the gods, born of sea and twilight. Old as rain, yet shaped like a girl in bloom. Her hair fell dark as wine. Her voice moved slowly, like sleep approaching. Her eyes held no urgency, no shock. She had seen many lost things wash up at her feet. She did not pity him. She did not scorn him. She lifted his broken body and carried him to her cave, a hollow of stone draped in ivy and light, filled with warm pools and the scent of sweet smoke. She washed the salt from his skin. She wrapped him in linen. She laid him upon moss and let the wind sing him into rest. For 7 days and 7 nights, he did not wake. When he opened his eyes at last, he saw her face and thought he had died. But she smiled gently and said, "No, you are not dead, though perhaps you wish you were." In time, his strength returned slowly, like an old tree remembering how to bloom. His muscles steadied. His breath deepened. He ate fruit from her trees and drank from springs so clear the sky reflected in every drop. His wounds healed. But something deeper did not. Each morning he sat at the mouth of her cave, staring out at the sea as though it still owed him something. Calypso brought him food and song, but he ate little and never sang. When she asked what he sought beyond the waves, he answered simply, "Ithaca." She did not flinch, but her eyes darkened. She offered him more than rest. She offered him eternity, a life beside her, free of war and sorrow, a deathless existence in the arms of an immortal. No aging, no pain, no kings, no gods, just the two of them on an island that never changed. She told him he was loved. She told him he had suffered enough. She told him the world of men had nothing left to give. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps Ithaca no longer waited. Perhaps Penelope had faded into memory. Perhaps his son had forgotten his face. But still, Odysseus said no. Each morning he sat upon the same rock, staring west, not because he hoped, not because he believed, but because he could not bear to stop. He had survived too much to surrender now. Calypso did not rage. She did not beg. She waited. And far above, where Olympus pierced the clouds and the gods spoke in murmurs that shook the world, the name of Odysseus was spoken again. Athena had not forgotten. Gray-eyed and patient, she had watched him lose everything and yet refused to yield. She stood once more in the golden halls, speaking of Ithaca, of a queen waiting in shadow, of a son growing into manhood without a father. She said it was time. Zeus listened. Perhaps he was moved. Perhaps he was bored. Perhaps he simply wished to hear the sound of judgment again. At last, he nodded. He turned to Hermes, swift-footed messenger, and gave the command that would ripple down through heaven and sea alike. "Go to Ogygia," he said. "Go to the nymph of command, farewell, and the shore where silence breaks." Zeus did not speak often. When he did, the world listened. "Tell Calypso," he said, his voice neither loud nor kind, "that the mortal she holds must be released. Not tomorrow. Not when she is ready. Now. The order cannot be refused. The time has come. Hermes bowed. He did not argue. He did not linger. Obedience was woven into his wings. With sandals fastened to his feet and a cloak spun from the pale light of dawn, he leapt from the edge of Olympus and crossed the world in the span of a breath. Mountains slipped beneath him like shadows. Seas folded and unfolded below. He passed through clouds thick as sheep's wool, through wind and rain and sudden stillness, until the island of Ogygia appeared beneath him, green and quiet, set like a jewel in silver water. He landed in the grove that circled Calypso's cave. Here, trees bore fruit in every season. Flowers bloomed without dying. The air never cooled, never warmed. Time itself seemed uncertain how to behave. Calypso saw him coming. She had been waiting. She met him at the threshold of her cave, her posture composed, her face calm, her eyes dark as the deep sea before a storm. She offered him food, as custom demanded, and wine that tasted faintly of memory and loss. Hermes did not sit. He did not drink. He unrolled the scroll bound in gold and read aloud words that carried the weight of thunder. She is to let the mortal go. He is to build a raft. She is to help him. She is to say farewell. As the words fell into the air, the cave seemed to draw inward. The light dimmed. The warmth thinned. Calypso did not speak. She did not weep. But her jaw tightened, and her hands curled slowly at her sides. When Hermes finished, he rolled the scroll closed. When he departed, she did not watch him go. Instead, she turned toward the sea. She stood there for a long time, listening to the waves, as though they might offer explanation or comfort. They offered neither. The gods had spoken. The game would continue. When she returned to the cave, Odysseus was waiting. He had seen the winged god pass overhead. He had felt the air shift, as if the island itself had exhaled. He asked her nothing. She answered with silence. Then, slowly, she told him what must be done. She would give him tools. She would give him wood. She would give him cloth for a sail, a cloak to guard against cold, and a wind to speed his passage. But she would not give him her blessing. Not because she did not love him, but because she did. He thanked her. She smiled in a way that made him look away. 4 days, he worked. He cut trees that had never known an axe. He shaped timbers beneath a sky that refused to change. He lashed them together with rope and sealed the seams with pitch. Calypso helped him without speaking of what came next. The raft took shape. The island remained silent. On the morning he set sail, she placed a satchel in his hands, bread enough to last, a skin of water, and a cloak woven with moonlight and memory. She kissed him once. Not gently. Not desperately. Only once. Then he was gone. She stood on the shore long after the sail vanished beyond the curve of the sea. Immortal still. Alone again. A prisoner of paradise, condemned to walk the same soft paths and sleep beneath the same unchanging stars, waiting for another broken soul to wash up at her door. The raft moved slowly across the open sea. A fragile skeleton of timber, held together by hope and stubborn will. It creaked with every swell, ropes groaning like old men in uneasy sleep. But it held. It floated. And for a time, the sea was kind, not generous, not warm, but kind enough. The wind Calypso had sent filled the sail and pushed him westward, always westward, toward the memory of home. Odysseus stood beneath the open sky, hands blistered by rope, eyes bleached by sun. There was no shelter, no shade, only salt and thirst and the quiet fear of what waited beneath the waves. It was not the sea that frightened him. It was Poseidon. The god of the sea had wandered far during Odysseus's long drifting. He had feasted among distant peoples, scattered storms across forgotten waters, and ignored Athena's pleas and Zeus's commands alike. But when he returned and saw the same mortal, cunning, unbroken, still alive, gliding across his realm once more, his rage woke like an ancient wound torn open. He rose from the depths in a chariot of foam, beard tangled with kelp, eyes dark with the weight of every drowned sailor who had ever begged him for mercy. He did not roar. He did not curse. He lifted his trident. The sea answered. A wind turned suddenly against Odysseus, biting like a hound that had slipped its leash. A squall followed, sharp and violent, tearing the sail from the raft and flinging it skyward like a discarded scrap. Waves rose in walls. Water broke over him again and again. The timbers cracked. The lashings snapped. The raft became driftwood once more. Poseidon watched, unmoved. A god does not apologize for vengeance. Odysseus clung to a single beam, slick with brine and blood. The sea tried to pull him under, dragging at his limbs, filling his mouth with salt and silence. For 2 days and nights, he floated, a speck in an endless world of water, watched by gulls and gods alike. He did not pray. He endured. And it might have ended there, had mercy not risen from the waves. From the sea emerged a woman of foam and wind and moonlit scales, Leucothea, once mortal, now something gentler and stranger. She saw him broken and near death and took pity. She offered him a veil woven from sea silk and memory. "Cast away your cloak," she told him. "Cast away the wreckage. Trust only this." Before he could answer, she was gone. Only the veil remained. He hesitated. Then he let go. He wrapped the veil around his chest and surrendered to the waves. The sea pulled him under, then released him again. 4 days, he drifted, mind fraying, body spent, until even the sea seemed to tire of its cruelty. At last, the current turned. Green hills rose beyond white sand. Tall cliffs stood like watchmen. Birds sang, breaking the long silence that had followed him across the world. He crawled onto the shore of Scheria like a man reborn from the ocean's womb. His hands dug into wet sand to test its truth. He kissed the earth, not as one who has returned home, but as one who has touched life again after centuries among the dead. Exhausted beyond weeping, he slept beneath olive trees leaning together like old friends. And when he woke, it was not a god who stood before him. It was a girl. Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete, had come with her handmaidens to wash garments by the river and laugh beneath the morning sun. Her voice rang out, bright and unafraid. Odysseus rose from the brush, salt-streaked and half-naked, a shadow of storms clinging to him. The maid scattered in fear, but Nausicaa did not run. She stood. She saw not a beast, but a man shaped by endurance. When he spoke, he did so carefully, weaving words as one weaves cloth long unused, asking not as a king, but as a stranger in need. And she listened. Of queens, names, and the sleep that carried him home. Nausicaa did not linger. Kindness, she seemed to know, must sometimes step back so that dignity may return. She gave him garments from the wagon, clean linen, soft against skin long scraped by salt and stone. She gave him oil to wash with, food to quiet the fire gnawing in his gut. And then she gave him counsel, spoken not as a child of the shore, but as one who understood the hidden currents of her father's house. "Do not come with us," she said gently. "Follow after. Appear alone at the gates. And when you stand before my mother, fall at her feet. Win her favor first. For it is the queen, not the king, who holds the balance in the court of the Phaeacians." So Odysseus waited. And when the dust of the wagon had settled and the laughter of the girls had faded into the distance, he rose and followed, clothed now in linen and dignity, though his feet still bled where stone remembered him. The city rose before him like a vision shaped by sleep and sunlight. Towers of marble and copper gleamed beneath the sky. Walls curved smooth as polished ivory. Streets flowed like quiet rivers between halls and courtyards where fountains sang in voices older than war. He walked through the gates unnoticed. Athena walked with him. She cloaked him in mist, not thick enough to blind, only enough to soften the gaze of men. Eyes passed over him without pause. Voices slid around him like water around stone. Guided by her unseen hand, he reached the great hall. There, upon her throne, sat Queen Arete. Odysseus knelt as Nausicaa had instructed, falling at her feet with the humility of a man who had lost too much to pretend otherwise. The queen looked down upon him with a gaze sharpened by years of rule and softened by time's quiet wisdom. She saw the wear in his skin, the fractures in his voice, the patience of suffering that no disguise could hide. And she listened. He did not name himself. Not yet. He spoke instead of storms and strange lands, of gods who lifted men only to cast them down again, of a wanderer who longed not for comfort, but for home. His words carried neither complaint nor boast, only the steady weight of truth endured. The king and queen offered him food and drink, and as he ate among them, Athena's mist fell away like breath on glass. Whispers stirred through the hall. For though he spoke as a guest, he carried himself as a prince. His posture held command. His silence carried sorrow. This was no castaway. This was a man shaped by purpose. At last, King Alcinous rose. He was a ruler of ships and peace, of harbors untouched by war. He asked plainly whether the stranger wished to be taken home. The Phaeacians were masters of swift vessels and silent sails. A crew could be summoned. A ship prepared. But first, they asked for his name. And so, as the firelight flickered across his face and the murmurs of the court fell silent, Odysseus spoke the words that had followed him across the world. "I am Odysseus," he said, "son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. And this is the story of my return." The hall grew still. It was a name carried by bards and rumor, whispered in foreign markets, spoken with reverence by some and fear by others. A name half myth, half memory. Yet here he stood, cloaked in firelight, eyes lined with salt and years, hands that had once shaped victory and now curled around a cup of wine. The court leaned forward, not with hunger, but with the reverence given to an old song finally sung by the man who first lived it. Odysseus drew a long breath. His eyes traveled beyond the painted rafters and torchlit walls, through smoke and shadow, to seas crossed too many times. He saw Troy again, its walls, its flames, the horse standing dark beneath the moon, a gift born not of the gods, but of his own cunning. He spoke not with pride, but with weariness. Of 10 years beneath armor. Of victory that tasted of ash. Of men who grew old waiting for home and died before they ever saw it again. Of gods who fought beside them and against them, whose favor shifted like sand. And when Troy fell, when fire swallowed towers and grief followed triumph, it should have been the end. But for him, it was only the beginning. When his voice finally stilled, the hall remained quiet. Not from doubt, but from weight, the kind that settles when something ancient has been uncovered and all present feel it pressed gently against their bones. King Alcinous stood once more. He spoke not of caution or payment, but of honor. No man who had suffered so long, he said, should wait another day to see his home again. He ordered his captains and craftsmen to prepare the finest ship in the fleet. Supplies would be loaded. A crew chosen. Odysseus would not row. He would rest, That night, a final feast was held. Singers came with lyres of golden wood. The bard Demodocus sang again of Troy, of Achilles, of Hector, of fire and grief. He did not name Odysseus. He did not need to. The man sat among them, quiet, his shadow long behind him. Queen Arete pressed gifts into his hands, a cloak stitched with silver thread, a chest of bronze filled with starlit treasure. She kissed his brow as a mother might and whispered words meant only for him. Nausicaa said little. Her eyes spoke farewell enough. When dawn came, the harbor lay hushed. The ship waited, curved like a swan's neck, eager beneath its furled sail. Odysseus walked to it slowly, his body still stiff, his heart braced for something he had not allowed himself in years. Hope. The sailors welcomed him without ceremony. He sat at the stern, wrapped in the queen's cloak, eyes fixed on the sea ahead. No speeches were made. The anchor was drawn. The wind filled the sail. The ship glided from the harbor like a dream slipping into sleep. The sea was calm. The gods were silent. And as the sun climbed the sky, Odysseus closed his eyes. He slept, not as a man hunted by monsters and gods, but as one who had earned rest. The ship moved swift as thought, carried not by straining arms, but by a will older than torment. He did not dream. For the first time in many years, his mind was quiet. And far ahead, beneath a pale sky and the whisper of olive leaves, Ithaca waited. Of stone ships, sleeping kings, and the home that no longer waited. This man was no longer merely a traveler. He was a vessel shaped by centuries of story, a living echo drawn out of myth and returned, briefly, to the world of breath and bone. When Ithaca finally lifted itself from the sea, a green spine rising from the vast blue, they did not shout or sing. No voice broke the air. The oars were lowered. The tide itself seemed to know what had arrived and carried them forward in silence. The harbor lay empty. No fisherman called out. No gull cried overhead. The cliff stood watchful and still, as if remembering. The olive trees did not stir. The water touched the hull in whispers only. This was not the return of a man greeted by his people. It was the return of a shadow to the place that had first cast it. They brought the ship to shore beneath the soft veil of twilight. Odysseus slept on, unmoved by the slowing of the sea or the land's nearness. The sailors lifted him gently, as one carries a sleeping child or the body of a fallen king. They laid him upon the sand, placed a chest of gifts beside him, and wrapped the queen's cloak more tightly about his shoulders. Then they left. Their duty was done. Their mercy complete. None stayed to witness the price of that mercy. For Poseidon had not forgotten. Even in silence, the sea god watches. When the Phaeacian ship reached the open water once more, swift, graceful, gliding like a swan upon the deep, his vengeance fell without sound. With a single glance, the prow stiffened. The deck followed. The sail hardened mid-billow. Wood became stone. Motion became memory. The sailors froze in the act of kindness, transformed into pale figures of salt and grief, their final compassion sealed forever. The ship sank, not as wreckage, but as a monument. A warning etched into the sea itself. Odysseus knew none of this. He woke alone on the shore of his homeland. The scent of earth rose to meet him, rich and dry, mingled with time and dust. Cicadas sang, familiar and strange all at once. He sat up slowly, stiffness spreading through his limbs, and looked around. Olive trees whispered in the breeze. The hills stood patient and green. A shepherd's path wound down toward the bay, overgrown and half forgotten. It was Ithaca. And yet, it was not the Ithaca he remembered. Time had passed its hand gently but firmly over the island. Stones were worn. Vines thickened. Silence settled where voices once rang. The land had waited, but it had changed. And so had he. He could not rise and walk openly into his halls. Not yet. He was no king here. He was a stranger on his own soil, a ghost moving among the living. His house no longer belonged to him alone. Suitors filled its rooms, men bloated with arrogance and wine, feasting on his stores, mocking his name. His son had grown to manhood without his hand to guide him. His servants had learned to live without his command. And Penelope, faithful or not, still endured, holding her court beneath the weight of waiting. If he returned now as he was, ragged and unknown, they would not bow. They would laugh. So Odysseus turned from the palace hill. He hid the gifts in a cave beneath the watchful gaze of the gods and wrapped his cloak tighter about himself. He took to the high ground, where goats wandered and the wind scoured stone bare. There, among the hills, he met a man tending swine. The man was bent by years and hardened by labor, yet strength still lived in his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried something deeper than habit. It carried loyalty. Odysseus listened. The man was Eumaeus, the swineherd, one who had once called him master. Yet Odysseus did not reveal himself. Not yet. He weighed the years in every word, measured time in tone and silence. In the low hut where Eumaeus lived, smoke curled through the thatch and stew simmered over a modest fire. Odysseus sat and ate in silence. The place was humble, but it felt more like home than any palace had in many years. Eumaeus spoke often, not with bitterness, but with the slow voice of one long left alone with memory. He spoke of Ithaca, of the suitors who infested the palace like vermin, feasting while the queen waited. He spoke of Penelope's loom, of how she wove by day and unraveled by night, binding time itself with thread. He spoke of Telemachus, of a son grown restless, who had gone seeking word of his father, stepping into a world of kings and liars with courage untested by blood. Odysseus listened. And with every word, a cold, steady fury took shape within him, not the rage of battle, nor the desperation of the sea, but the patient wrath of a man who had endured too much to fade quietly. His house had been claimed by thieves. His people lived beneath the shadow of mockery. His son searched for a ghost. Yet here, in smoke and clay, loyalty endured. That night, as the fire burned low and wind moved through the olive trees, Odysseus spoke to the gods, not in prayer, not in plea, but in acknowledgement. He named them softly. Athena, Zeus, Poseidon. If they still watched, they would see him now. Not broken, not begging, but returned. Days later, Telemachus came home. Guided by Athena, he arrived at the hut as the sun sank behind the hills. Father and son stood beneath the olive trees, strangers bound by blood and distance. The boy had last seen his father as a child. The man before him had become a myth. Recognition did not come at once. It came through words, through answers, through truth. When Odysseus revealed himself, it was without spectacle. His voice was low, his face lined, proud and worn. And when the truth settled, Telemachus fell into his father's arms. Plans were made. Quiet plans. The suitors still feasted, unaware. They did not know the king had returned. They did not know the son had become a man. They did not know the gods had begun to watch again. Odysseus would return to his palace not as a conqueror, but as a shadow. He would wear the face of a beggar and carry no blade. He would cross his own threshold unseen. And when truth finally rose, when names were reclaimed and silence broke, it would not be with mercy. It would be with the quiet, final justice of a king who had come home. Of beggars, bows, and the bed that could not be moved. They were certain the king would never return. The gods had claimed him, they said. The sea had swallowed him whole. Men do not come back from 20 years of storm and silence. And so they drank. They plotted. They laughed too loudly in halls that did not belong to them, waiting for the queen to choose one of their number and surrender her crown and her body in the same weary breath. They mistook time for victory. They mistook absence for death. They did not see the storm gathering inside their own walls. Odysseus entered his palace as a beggar. His back was bent. His hair hung in ash-matted strands. His beard was wild, his skin weathered and scarred. Even his voice had changed, roughened by years of screaming into wind that never answered. No one recognized him. No one rose. No one bowed. They jeered. They shoved him aside with careless hands, flung scraps of meat at his feet, mocked his hunger and his smell. They treated him as one treats a stray dog hovering at the edge of a feast. Odysseus accepted it all. He did not argue. He did not plead. He watched. He studied faces as a sculptor studies stone. He counted blades. He measured distances between pillars and men. He marked who laughed loudest and who stayed silent. He noted which servants averted their eyes, and which suitors leaned too easily on their swords. He learned the shape of his enemies with the patience of a hunter who has waited years for the final shot. Telemachus played his role perfectly. The son who had once wandered foreign halls in search of news now sat beside the very man he sought, silent, controlled. His eyes carried the truth, but his voice betrayed nothing. He waited as his father waited. Blood called to blood, but discipline held them still. Even the gods seemed to pause. Penelope remained apart. She watched the beggar from the shadows, her gaze sharp, her heart stirring with an unease she could not name. There was something in his stillness, something in the way he stood, in the way he endured insult without shrinking. But she did not ask. Hope had betrayed her too many times. At last, the moment came. Not with steel drawn, not with thunder, but with a test. Penelope brought forth the bow. The great bow of Odysseus. Carved from horn, polished smooth by time and memory, strung with sinew thick as fate itself. A weapon few could even lift, let alone bend to their will. One by one the suitors tried. Their arms trembled. Their pride cracked. The bow would not yield. They laughed to hide their shame. Then the beggar stepped forward. Mockery erupted. Insults flew. Some called for him to be beaten back. But Penelope, veiled and silent, gave her consent without a word. Telemachus cleared the space. Odysseus took the bow. He strung it not with strain, but with remembrance. His fingers knew the curve. His shoulders recalled the pull. The string sang, a sound like an old song long forbidden. He notched an arrow. He aimed. He released. The shaft cut the air cleanly and struck true, burying itself in the target with a sound that silenced the hall. Then Odysseus spoke. His voice rang out, clear and unbroken, stripped of all disguise. He named himself. He claimed his house. He spoke the names of the suitors and named their crimes one by one. Before the echoes faded, he fired again. The first man fell with an arrow in his throat. Panic erupted. But the doors were barred. The swords were gone. Odysseus moved like a force long denied its shape. Arrow after arrow flew, each one a judgment passed. Telemachus stood at his side. Eumaeus joined them. So did Philoetius. Faithful men. Silent men. Blood painted the stone. Men who had mocked the name of Odysseus now begged it for mercy. He gave none. Not after the years stolen. Not after the halls defiled. Not after the throne usurped and the heart of his queen wounded by waiting. This was not vengeance. It was balance. When the final body fell, silence returned. Torches flickered softly once more. Odysseus stood alone in the center of the hall, the bow still in his hand, his eyes cold with a fire that had burned too long to fade gently. The slaughter was done. Yet still, he did not weep. Penelope waited. She did not rush to him. She did not collapse with joy. She stood apart, armored by years of restraint. Servants whispered. Word reached her. Still, she held back. A stranger in rags claimed to be the man she had buried in her mind long ago. She would not be fooled by hope again. Athena came unseen. She touched Odysseus' shoulders. His back straightened. His youth returned. The weariness of the sea fell from him like an old cloak. When he stood before Penelope, he looked as he had when he left for Troy. Still, she did not smile. She tested him. She ordered the servants to move the marriage bed. At that, Odysseus spoke at once. That bed, he said, could not be moved. He had built it himself from the trunk of an olive tree, rooted deep in the earth. He had shaped their life around it, carved their bond into wood and stone. Only one who had severed the tree could move it. Penelope wept. She crossed the room and took him in her arms, not as queen to king, but as wife to husband. The years collapsed between them like dry leaves. That night, they returned to the olive bed. They spoke little. There were too many stories. Too many scars. Too many silences that no words could fill. They lay together, whole once more. The gods had tested them. The sea had scattered them. Time had tried to erase them. But they endured. And as Ithaca slept beneath silver moonlight, the king and queen were reunited. And that, dear listener, is the end. Sleep well. Good night.